have some introduction on your own background, as we see already. But for those maybe who joined the last year's ALE conference in Berlin, might have heard your presentation there. And that was actually one of the points where many of the community people from the ALE network got into contact with you, and we were happy to host you tonight. So
yeah,
Stephen,
that's great.
Go ahead.
Thank you very much, and I'm really pleased to be invited to talk to you this evening. Those of you who saw my presentation at the ALE conference in Berlin will recognize probably some of the early slides, the 2 slides at the beginning, but then I'll go on to talk about something different after that. Okay, let me just tell you a little bit about myself. I come from engineering. I've been in engineering for about 25 years. I started with Digital Equipment Corporation many years ago. So those of you can probably position how old I am from that. I worked on BACS clusters, in tech support, etc. From that, I moved out into thinking about what's the best way to design, build, and operate organizations, mainly IT organizations at that time. And that's when I had my early introduction to Lean. But I applied Lean mostly to the design of organizations. How can we design organizations that get the best out of people? How can we design organizations that get out of the way of ingenuity, creativity, rather than the typical command and control compliance regime? After that, I went on and worked with Fujitsu for a number of years, helping set up a very different way of doing outsourcing, which was basically based on, instead of processing all the work for repairs, is finding out ways of making sure that infrastructures, including applications, were much more stable and didn't produce problems or errors, and were producing real business outcomes. So that's my background. I then went on and worked with Dan Jones, who's at the Lean Enterprise Institute. For those of you who don't know, Dan Jones and Jim Womack wrote the early books on Lean and brought Lean from the world of Toyota to the West, and I have been appointed as a special advisor to Dan Jones on Lean in services, and particularly Lean in IT environments. In recent years, I've been working with a number of people that are working with the Agile community. I'm very interested in what's going on there. And I do at this point in time want to mention a great colleague of mine who unfortunately passed away quite recently. That's Grant Rule. He was great inspiration to me in terms of understanding software development measurement and a lot of the Agile approaches. So what I'm going to talk about today is a very tight subject, which you'll find, which is one of the sections in the Sense and Respond book, which is on the screen at the moment. The purpose of the Sense and Respond book was not to talk about tools and techniques, but it was really aimed at CIOs or CEOs or COOs to really think about Lean, and under that umbrella we're talking about Agile as well, as probably different ways of designing, building, and running organizations, and even developing new products and services that are really customer focused. And to get out of this, this cycle of strategic planning every year, coming up with a big strategy, and there's a big shift to the left or a big shift to the right, why don't we create an organization where the people within that organization deeply understand what customers want and continue to respond to that? And so therefore the strategy of the organization is responding to what the employees are saying about their customers. And that's a very different way to design, build, and operate the organizations. But you have to think differently to be able to do that. And this is what this presentation is about, is how do we start thinking and changing the mindset to enable change? So let's get straight into this. I'm going to ask a question. What is wrong with the traditional measurement approach? what I'm saying here is the measurements that organizations choose to put in place, the KPIs, the performance indicators, actually tell a lot about the thinking and the attitude an organization has both to its employees and its customers. And I'm going to show you a very simple technique very shortly to actually start having a conversation in your business about what should we be measuring and what is a good measure. But first of all, let's understand what's wrong with the traditional measurement approach. Well, what we have on the screen is basically, if you imagine, most organizations are split up into functions. There's nothing wrong intrinsically with that. However, if you've got function 1 going to function 2, all the way up to function n, doesn't matter how many there are, these functions are often assigned their own budget. They often have their own targets. They're all very different. And they hope that if each of these functions does the right job, then the sum of these parts will add up to a whole that delivers service. What we then find actually is maybe the COO or the CEO or even the CIO might saying, well, look, we need some suggestions on how we can reduce our operating costs, maybe. So he issues out a command to all the heads of the department from F1 to Fn to come up with suggestions for their departments. Obviously, this is silo thinking that we're talking about, so we're going to have silo solutions. So each of the managers might come up with solution 1 for function 1, solution 4 for function 4, etc. What these guys then often do is they say, well, these are some suggestions that the guy in function 4 is thinking about, and he wants to impress the boss, saying, look, I've got the best cost containment program, or and this is how I can improve the throughput, this is how I can get more utilization of my staff, whatever those measures are, and they're usually functional measures. So you come up with those suggestions. It's usually at a planning session where each manager displays what he thinks he should be doing. And then usually the one with the best PowerPoint presentation or the best presentation skills might get the limited resources for their project, and some of them are then rejected. What then happens is 1 or 2 of the functions implement their ideas, and what you see on the bottom there is the throughput process, because the customer sees not the functions, but sees it as a throughput process. When you have different functions implementing different solutions, what you might end up happening is, say, function 2 has reduced its operating costs, but actually it's inadvertently transferred the costs from function 2 to function 3. Now, function 3 might start having difficulties, but doesn't understand that the reason they're getting problems now and they're starting to process waste is because costs have been transferred from function 2, but they're completely unaware of that. So you imagine in a complex world with a value chain, everything from coming up with the requirements for an application, developing the application, deploying that application, then supporting that application and retiring. That's a whole life cycle that includes not just the agile development of it, but also the infrastructure management of that application all the way to upgrade and then decommissioning at the end. All that is the value chain, and every part of that value chain is cut up into different functions that have measurements that don't line up end to end. What this happens is it then chops up the customer's experience end to end into these different segments. So that's the traditional approach. There isn't a common measurement set across the value stream, so therefore each of them are working to different objectives, different budget constraints, and different priorities. It is no wonder that we fragment the value chain for the customer. It's no wonder that we introduce more rework or refactoring into the process. So if we need to start thinking about changing this type of organization, we need to start thinking about, well, what do we measure? Do we measure things functionally and vertically, or do we measure it from the customer's perspective end to end to really improve that customer experience and to deliver what they want in terms of business outcomes. Okay. What I want to do is just introduce you into a very simple concept. What I'm about to show you is not scientifically rigorous. It's not intended to be. It's really a mechanism for starting a discussion within your organization about what we should be measuring, how we should be measuring, and can we move away from the silo measurement system and regimes that we have in place. But before we do that, I just want to introduce you to Statistics 101. And I'm very surprised that even today I'm delivering some management briefings, that what I have on the screen here is news to a lot of managers. And I find that very strange and inexplicable. What we have here is, if you say we have one company called the green company and one company called the red company, and say you're going to, I don't know, ask these companies to bid for a contract, and you want 90% compliance on average on the work they deliver to you. Well, you can see both the red company and the green company actually achieve a 90% average. But the real thing here is, what is the range? Okay, and I ask a very simple question here to the management teams that I'm working with. Which company would you engage? Both of them are complying with a 90% compliance. But there's a different range. And about 50-50 will go for the 50-50 split between the red company and the green company. Well, of course, the answer is really, what we really need to have is a very short range around the 90%. But you'd be surprised that people often said, well, the other company, the red company, often achieves 100%, that's great, until I point out, well, actually, they often do 80% as well. So the very simple question is, do we want to have an organization that has wide variation in its delivery capability, or a narrow range in its capability? It's the range that kills. And most organizations throw away the range information and just use the average. Lots of SLAs and targets are just average figures, but very often the customer doesn't get average. He has the extreme. You know, talking about averages, just working on average is a bit like saying, I got 1 foot in molten lava, I have another foot in liquid nitrogen, and on average I should feel comfortable. Well, that's obviously not a good experience for the customer. It's the extremes and the unpredictability of those extremes that cause most of the problems. So just bear that in mind as I move forward. When I say, if you measure your business using averages, do not be surprised to find yourself running an average business. So averages, as far as the customer is concerned, don't matter. You know, if I'm trying to get my software delivered on time and it's taking a long time, quoting me the average, which looks good, to me as a customer makes no sense. So this is something you can do back in the workplace just to stimulate this conversation. It's a 4-box matrix. Along the bottom, we've got a very simple question. Does this measure, or this KPI, matter to the customer? No or yes. And the other measure, the other dimension, the vertical dimension is this a functional measure, and is this an end-to-end measure? Now, realistically, what we want to do is each of the functions need to be working on a common end-to-end measure, but they don't. They work on diverse functional measures. So what I've done with this is just give you an illustration. The actual measures don't really matter here because they vary by industry, they vary by the different types of work. The thing we need to think about here is, does this matter to the customer? Is it functional, or is it end-to-end? And as an example, I populated here, for those of you who are aware of IT support, will be familiar with ITIL. These are some of the recommended measures from ITIL. And as you can see, most of the measures do not matter to the customer. Most of the measures are actually functional. So it's no surprise when we focus everybody on these measures that the customer very often is complaining that we are unresponsive. The customer is complaining that you are quoting statistics and SLAs, which are all green, by the way, but the end-to-end business is red as far as the customer is concerned. So we have this disconnect between what we measure and what's important to the customer. But we also fool ourselves internally in saying, we meet all these targets, so we must be good. So let's take that point forward and just explore that a little bit with some real examples from some customers that have gone through some change. What we see on the screen is some work that was done by some people that were working in application support and IT support in supporting, in this case, a police force. This was IT infrastructure for a very large police force in the UK. And we just went through this simple exercise. Let's take all the measures, your KPIs, and plot them on this graph. And as you can see, the measures came out. Lots of them were end-to-end, and these mattered to the customer. And everybody was feeling very pleased with themselves and said, this is fantastic, this is great. Yes, we said we were customer-focused. So what happened then was we went out and we spoke to some police officers, we spoke to the general public, and we spoke to some commissioners of police, and we came back a week later. And something quite extraordinary had happened. Now understand, nothing had changed in the real world. But having them go out and visit the customer, as I said, something extraordinary had happened. Their handwriting had improved tremendously. No, I'm only joking. What had happened was their perception of what mattered to the customer changed completely. These are the same measures. It doesn't matter what's there. Okay. What they realized was they had functional measures. They weren't even common between the functions. They were all different. They weren't end-to-end, and they didn't matter to the customer. Now you can see on the top of this picture, it's got strategic development performance. How does IT contribute to these? I've actually blanked that out because it's confidential about what the police force strategy was. But none of these measures about delivering applications or even IT support had anything to do with policing outcomes. So that was one way of changing the mindset from actually we think we're doing okay, everything is green, but the customers, well, they're complaining. Well, they always do, don't they? We always say those sorts of things to ourselves to justify continuing our old ways. Let's move this forward to something else. It gets a little bit more serious, actually. What we have here is a young man presenting his analysis from our measurements internally on how we develop and deploy applications. Again, no surprise, it doesn't matter to the customer, and they were functional. All right. But on the other side here, in the blue stickies, as you can see, they did something different here. They went out to their users. This is in the public sector, by the way. They went out to their users and they asked them what they are measured on in their business. And therefore, they plotted all the users' measures. And as you can see, all the users' measures were functional and didn't matter to the customer. Now this presents a problem. If you are in application development and you're getting your requirements from your users are not even customer focused. They're going to try and find solutions from the applications to sort out their pain, their problems to meet their targets, which by the way do not meet the needs of, in this case, the citizens of a very large city in the UK. We have another one. This one looked very similar to the earlier ones. This one is a very large applications development company. What we did here was to say, well, we mapped the measures and it looked very similar to the other ones. But here, after interviewing across the this company about something like 50 managers, senior managers and mid-managers, what their pain points were. So we then mapped their pain points on the same matrix. It is no surprise that the pain the managers were feeling were functional, and guess what? It didn't matter to the company, the customers rather. But it did matter to the company because that's what they thought. Now the interesting thing is here, from a lean perspective, they're not even feeling the right pain. In lean terms, they're feeling waste pain. Now if you go to these managers and say, well, how do we improve your business? They'll say, take my pain away. But as we've identified, it's the wrong pain. If the pain they were feeling was all in the box, that was end-to-end and mattered to the customer, maybe that's what we should be working on. So I come back to this slide from the police force again. Which mindset is open to change? These are the same group of people with only a week between. What they did was spend some time with the customer, in this case, the police officers, members of the public. They suddenly realized their measures had no bearing on the outcomes. So if you want to change an organization, we have to change the perspective that their current measurements, which most of the time they're meeting are green, are actually the wrong measurements. We cannot change an organization if what they think at the moment is okay. And this is just one mechanism to really shake things up and say, well, what should we be measuring? I often get the question, well, if those aren't the measures, those functional measures, what should we be measuring? What does matter to the customer? They ask me. And I usually turn around and say, that's the question you should be asking your customers, not me. Okay, so that's a very short introduction to some of the techniques that are in the Sense Respond book about thinking about how we design the organization end-to-end. Measurement is a key part of that. It's not the only thing, but it is an important thing. What you measure demonstrates what you think. It demonstrates what you think about your employees. It demonstrates what you think about your customers. And most organizations design employees out of the process and design customers out of the process. We really need to be designing them back in. And I believe that is the fundamental aim of Agile and the fundamental aim of Lean. We need to design the customer back in with the employees that create value, ingenuity, and we should be using the frontline operations to drive the business. That's me. I'm open to questions.
Great. Thanks, Stephen, for this very interesting talk. Yeah, now it's up to the audience. Any questions from your side? So no questions so far. But maybe I have a question, Stephen.
Sure.
In terms of, KPIs, all these maturity models we find out there, CMMI, SPICE, whatever they're called. What is your experience or, let's say, impression in terms of organizations applying those systems? Are they bound to, or actually limited in designing towards the customer, or building the customer into their process?
My answer to that is quite simple. Things like ITIL and CMMI, Lean and Agile have the same objectives, which is to really create value for the customer and over the long term create security and wealth for the employees and the organization. And that is the order in which we do that. The problem is that you can use ITIL, you can use CMMI, and you can drive the wrong measurements. And it can give you the illusion that you're doing good things. They're going green, I'm reducing my costs after all. But really, the question that we need to be asking is, does this create business value for our customer? And very often, most of the people inside the organization don't engage with the customer. They don't understand what they really want. They just, within their function, they need to do that function or that activity and do it a lot. Okay, and I have somebody maybe checking that I do that a lot. So it's more about the utilization of the person rather than the value and the outcomes I create for the customer. Because it's very often seen as, well, the customer may be way downstream from me and, well, that's too far away. I just concentrate on my local target. Well, to be honest with you, that's a cop-out. Absolutely. Unless there's a clear line of sight between every activity you do and customer value, you have no idea whether you're producing value or waste. Okay. So some of the intentions of CMMI and ITIL, I understand, but let's understand what we are trying to do with those things. You can use CMMI and ITIL to make the mass production functional model go faster. You can do that, and you can convince yourself you're doing the right thing. But you can also use those for a lean operating model, and that supercharges everything.
Okay, thanks. So there is one question, or maybe one final question, because we're quite ahead in time, from Inga Lill Holmqvist. I just want to forward you this question. So Inga asks, can we have measures only in the end-to-end and let's say quadrant which matters to customers, or do we still need to have some in the others as well, e.g. for financial measures?
I'm putting up on the screen some of the ITIL measures. What I want to make sure here is that I'm not misunderstood. I'm not saying the measures in the box where it says no and they're functional. I'm not saying they're not important. They are. But the measures in the boxes for functional and end-to-end and no are usually related to resource of some kind, generally. Not 100%, but probably 90% of the time. They're focused on utilization of my delivery resource. They are talking about efficiency. On the other side of what matters to the customer, this is about effectiveness. And the problem that we've got is we don't have the right balance between these. And very often some of these functional measures, which are really focused on controlling costs and increasing utilization, are devolved as targets for frontline staff. That is the trap. What I'm recommending is anything to do with the numbers of people to do the job, you target the manager on that. It is a trap to devolve those down to the staff. What you should be devolving down to the frontline staff are measures of effectiveness, which are in the top right-hand quadrant in this case. They will drive the effectiveness. It's up to the manager then to make sure, maybe working with the staff, to work out ways of making it efficient. But very often we look at efficiency first and sometimes never even look at effectiveness, as some of these descriptions show. But Lean says, understand your customer, deliver what they need first. Then you become efficient at delivering that. But very often we deliver the wrong things to the customer. We put efficiency measures in and we start delivering the wrong thing to the customer in a more efficient way. All we end up doing is we have cheaper, neater, faster waste, which is nuts.
Okay, that was great. Thanks for your answer. So I would suggest that we continue with the next talk. So once again, thanks, Stephen, for this presentation. And once again to everyone, the presentation recording, like all the others, will be available after the bathtub some days online.